The history of the Port of Los Angeles begins with unpromising geography and evolves from the emergence of America's second-largest city. It is a timeline for more than 200 years of U.S. economic and political change, from our nation's early growth, expanding to fill a continent, through wars, booms, depressions, and dramatic social change. It's also the story of small, close-knit harbor communities and people from around the world who worked to create one of the world's most prosperous and productive economic regions. It's the story of the making of America's busiest port. The Port of Los Angeles began in peaceful isolation. Territory conquered during the Mexican War of the 1840s made it American. Railroads came after the Civil War, encouraging the population booms that led to the creation of a man-made harbor. In the first decades of the 20th century, immigrants arrived, remaking American culture. Many found homes in San Pedro and Wilmington. In 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor and World War II transformed America and the Port of Los Angeles as never before.
Pearl Harbor happens. The world goes into turmoil. Pedro changes.
Within hours after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, FBI and other law enforcement descended on San Pedro, especially Terminal Island. Leaders in the Japanese community were arrested. Their families anxiously waited.
We were just flabbergasted. We didn't know what was going to happen to us. Because next day we had to go to school, and we got into the ferry landing, and we went across the bay. MPs came. They locked all the doors. They won't let us out. You know, we're junior high school kids, 12, 13. So finally the principal came and got us out.
My mother would say, when you come home from school and when your mother and father's not here, that means we have been arrested. Funny, my mother would worry about us like that, or something would happen to them. So what she did was give each of us money. In case of emergency, you need to eat, there's nothing to eat in the house, your mother and father's gone, you need to look after each other.
On February 9, 1942, all licensed Japanese fishermen were arrested and sent to North Dakota. On February 25th, the remainder of Japanese terminal islanders were given 48 hours to prepare to leave for internment camps far from the West Coast.
The school allowed everybody to release early, because the next day, that was the last day for the kids. And all the girls were hugging, you know, the other girls. Well, you know, these were friends since for a long time.
They told me, we give you the store, you take it. And one guy just bought a new meat case, it paid $2,000 for the meat and that. You take everything, you keep it. When the war over, we come home, you give it back. If we don't come back, you keep it. And then the next night, all the carpetbaggers hit town and just looted the whole damn place, you know.
Unlike many San Pedrans, most Americans had never met a Japanese person. But the United States was in a state of fear, and San Pedro was not immune, especially after a lumber freighter was torpedoed by a roaming Japanese submarine 2 miles off of Point Furman. Questions of constitutional rights went unanswered. The war brought the Depression to an abrupt end. Jobs in San Pedro were plentiful. The harbor faced a rush of newcomers.
I'd never even seen the ocean, and all I knew is working on the farm and milking cows in the evening and feeding them the stock and going ahead and do it. And then I came to California. It was a different life altogether. But there were so many people at that time had came off of the Depression days, and why they hired a little old boy like me, I could never figure out. But I enjoyed working it. I never would want to go back to that farm. This was my life.
All the soldiers were drafted. Kids from all over the United States, New York, Chicago, Oklahoma, Arkansas, all come into Fort MacArthur here, port of de-embarkation, shipping out as well as in Frisco. And all the hub of activity, all the wartime activities taking place, and ships loading up with the cargoes to haul to the servicemen in the battlefields and the islands. It woke San Pedro up. San Pedro was sort of like a sleeping village in a way, but that just threw it on the map right away,
The Navy took over operations of the Port of Los Angeles. Everything was devoted to the war effort, especially shipbuilding.
Liberty ships and sea ships and Victories were all built here in San Pedro. And at Consolidated Steel over by Craig Shipyard built Liberty ships that carried creosoted pilings to build docks, and clothes and food and Coca-Cola and ammunition, just everything that was needed. And they were all riveted and side-launched. They didn't have room to back them out across the channel, so they had to go out on a side launch. But to watch those things get cut loose and just go sideways, crashing down into the water, was quite a sight.
We drove the first piling at Cal Ship in February of 1941. And I was the 108th man hired out of 55,000. See, these ships were built on an assembly line, and every piece on the ship had a mark where it went. From the mold off, there's a template for every single plate and every bracket on the whole ship. We had to launch it almost every night. When they broke the bottle, the whistle would blow until the ship hit the water. And you could hear it all over the yard. And everybody would stop work and look over to the ship that was going down. Well, it got so commonplace that nobody paid any attention. We delivered almost a ship a day. We put the knives and forks and everything on the ship and put the crew on the ship before it left. And that would run about 26 days. Toward the end, we were making up the beds and everything. And then if everything worked good, they hoisted a new broom up on top of the mast, and meaning a clean sweep.
In 1942, California shipbuilding set a record, 23 cargo vessels in a single month. 15% of American defense workers were women.
All of a sudden, there was all this work, and I go to work for Associated Banding Company, which was in Wilmington. I learned a lot about the longshore industry, the people that are involved in loading and unloading ships. I didn't realize how important it was to live in a harbor town and that so much cargo came through here from all over the world. You know, you think you exist in just a little town, but you don't.
Beacon Street in downtown San Pedro had a rowdy reputation since the 1900s. As the Islander ferry shuttled tens of thousands of passengers around the clock, the war years made Beacon Street world famous.
Oh, Beacon Street was wide open. I mean, on the street level, they had all the gin mills, and down below, under the gin mills, they had the Chinese gambling joints. And up on the second floor, they had the cat houses. And there must have been 10,000 sailors a day that came ashore. And I used to feel sorry for the soldiers at Fort MacArthur, because there's just a handful of those. And whenever they'd get in them barroom brawls or on the waterfront down here, the soldiers didn't stand a chance.
down in Beacon Street. There was the Shanghai Red, the Bank Cafe, Ocean Club. Oh, there was many. I think it must have been 20 bars. And I used to go in each bar and sell newspapers.
Shanghai Red was a place that if you were a seaman, go to a foreign port and they'd say you were from San Pedro, and they'd say, "Have you ever been in Shanghai Red?" And it was known worldwide.
Shanghai Red, Eisenberg. I used to call him Red when I was a kid, didn't know any other name. He used to say, "Hey kid, did you eat?" If you said no, he said, "Come on in." He'd make a sandwich for you, treated you like your family.
Fights were common on Beacon Street, and many a rabble-rouser ended up behind bars on the 7th floor jail at City Hall. With a commanding view of the harbor, it was known as Seventh Heaven.
And a lot of these merchant marines that would get in trouble, or a lot of these sailors that would get in trouble, would be locked up, and they'd watch their ship go down the harbor and leave without them.
Adding to its colorful reputation, Shanghai Red once had a female bouncer, Cairo Mary. Even with all the boozy celebrations on Beacon Street, by the end of the war, port shipyards were able to launch 3 large ships in a single 2.5-hour period. During World War II, the San Francisco Bay Area was the major West Coast center for military operations and shipbuilding. But the Port of Los Angeles contributed nearly 1,000 ships and handled 10 million tons of cargo and 500,000 traveling service personnel. When victory finally came in 1945, for returning San Pedro veterans and their families, it was a time of relief and celebration.
I still had my uniform on and everything else. And so I went over on the island on a ferry and surprised my dad in the Cannery. I'll never forget that day. It was such a memorable day. And all the people started applauding at the Cannery line and everything else when my dad and I hugged each other. And so that was a very treasured moment for me.
For San Pedro's Japanese terminal islanders, it was a bittersweet return.
Well, when I got back to Terminal Island, of course we went to see what it looked like, but nothing left, no sign of our homes. Everything was crushed, broken down.
The stores, the homes, they're all demolished. We can never get back here. Never. It's gone.
We feel pretty sad, huh? Something missing, like, But that was our home sweet home.
Their community on Terminal Island was gone, but some Japanese Americans returned to the harbor area. Elsewhere, Japanese Americans were often met with resentment and suspicion. But in San Pedro and Wilmington, it could be different.
First day of school, I went in the classroom, and the teacher introduced me, and one kid come running up and hugged me. Big burly guy. I didn't know who he was. "Oh, Minoru, I'm so glad you're back." He hugs me. He said, I didn't know. He said, "Oh, this is Bill. I'm Bill Padme." I said, "Oh, really, Bill?" He had grown so big.
By 1946, the harbor returned to civilian control, and soon commerce was booming again. Ironically, a major U.S. export was scrap from World War II combat and cargo ships, many of them built in the Port of Los Angeles.
You can't believe how many ships we had, and landing craft, and destroyers, destroyer escorts, supply ships, hospital ships, aircraft carriers, and there wasn't any place to put them. They had every inlet and every harbor full of ships. We scrapped 500 ships altogether.
As the post-war era settled in, San Pedro and Wilmington became busy small towns again.
There was a large difference between the communities of Wilmington and San Pedro. San Pedro was really more European in many ways. You had lots of Croatians, Italians, Portuguese, and Norwegians. And in Wilmington, we had a large population of Pacific Islanders. We had Hispanics and African Americans. So we had a much different demographic makeup than San Pedro. And also the work ethic was a little different too. In San Pedro, you would have lots of families that were involved in fishing and ship's chandlery work. And in Wilmington, they were really pretty much more dock-related people working for the ILWU as union longshoremen, marine clerks, and foremen.
Wilmington, at that time, you had everything. You didn't have to go any other place. We had car dealers, we had furniture stores, we had like a gigantic mall. We had everything right here. We didn't have to go any other place.
In the 1950s, with a population of 53,000, the town of San Pedro had come a long way since its founding in 1888.
I just loved the town, just loved it right from the beginning. Every store was nice. There was San Pedro Hardware, there was Lillian's, there was Hill's Pierman Sport Shop. My mother had this dress shop. There were a lot of nice stores. The customers, they were basically a lot of working gals, and they'd come on their lunch hour.
While life in San Pedro and Wilmington moved at a small-town pace, at the harbor, the post-war era was changing fast. In 1948, work had begun on a new $11 million passenger and freight terminal. Soon, passenger travel returned to the harbor. But by the 1950s, the Port of Los Angeles was best known as the commercial fishing capital of the world. In San Pedro, fishing was more than a profession. It was a family tradition.
To tell you the truth, this may seem odd to you, but our fun at that is being able to go fishing with your dad. I was only 6, 7 years old, and he wakes me up in the morning, and I look in the hole, and there was tuna there. And there was about 10 ton of tuna. They lower me down and pick the biggest one you can find, you know. So I grabbed one, and I barely was able to lift it up. And I never forget, they had big hands. Like my father was a little man, but their hands were like baseball gloves, you know. And my father's cousin grabs it, the tail with his nail, and brings it up. And see, that was your share at the time. And you take it to the markets, and you'd make $1, and that was big money then.
As fishermen gathered to repair their nets and share tall tales, to curious local kids, a 1950s afternoon at the Port of Los Angeles could seem like a visit to an Italian fishing village, especially around noon.
And they would just say, "Come on down, we're having lunch." I mean, we're talking lunch. We're talking a big plate of spaghetti and hot French bread, and you're just sitting there, and they're having their wine, you know. It's the best lunch you would ever you would want to be there all the time.
In 1950, an ultra-modern municipal fish market was built. 2 years later, Starkist's new canning plant packed 350 million pounds of fish a year, supplied by 3,000 local fishermen.
It used to be kind of a joking matter that just a block from here was the ferry building, and the cannery workers would take the ferry at home every night, and they were dressed in whites like nurses, and strangers from out of town would come and say, "Boy, they must have a big hospital around here." Well, then if you got close to them, you realized they weren't nurses, they were cannery workers by their odor, that they just, in the bus and all, would just reek when the gals would go home in the evening.
To San Pedrans, the stench of canneries could also smell sweet.
There's a mixed emotion about it, because as my father always said, the smell of tuna in the air was the smell of money.
In Wilmington, the flourishing post-war canning industry offered opportunities for local entrepreneurs. One drew upon the fishing heritage of his Japanese mother and canning expertise of his Mexican-American father.
Right after World War II, my dad's nephew, Albert Guerrero, and he was only younger by 5 years, he came to my dad and he said, why don't we start a business, a fish canning business? They had a knowledge of fish canning from their experiences of working on Terminal Island. Albert was a mechanic. He ran the steamers and the canning equipment and so on. My dad ran the warehouse. Somewhere in the area of about 1950, Albert's wife, Ruth, made the suggestion to him, why don't you try canning some menudo, which is a very traditional Mexican soup. There was just no Mexican food commercially being sold in the marketplace. So we were one of the early pioneers in the Mexican food category. We can safely say that Wilmington is actually the menudo capital of the world.
At the harbor, there was always opportunity for men willing to listen to their wives and take risks.
My lovely wife said, why don't you sell fish? You got a lot of that BS. He says, you sell fish? She says, we can make a go of it. And I did. I built my truck, iced it up, picked up fish from the markets, went from door to door, and made a great living out of it. Customer would come out and say, oh, I like that. I have something better for you. I'd open the side door. Same fish. I shouldn't tell you this. Oh, Vito, Vic, can't say Vito. Vic, you treat me so good. Give me 2 pounds, okay? But you have to have that in business.
The war brought new technologies to the harbor, but old ways continued. Since the 1900s, machinists were essential to port operations.
The job of a machinist in those days was different than the term machinist of today. And technology has done that. But a machinist of those days had to not only be proficient in the harbor area, in the shipyard environment on the waterfront, would also have to become diesel engine proficient, as well as being able to run every machine tool in the shop. A lot of the canning machinery was designed and fabricated in the local machine shops in the area. It was as many boats as could be built. The local shops were installing diesel engines in them, from tugboats to fish boats to work boats to just anything that went.
Harbor pilots and tugboat captains are essential to port efficiency and safety, but they could be an independent and colorful lot. Before electronic megaphones, whistles were used to communicate between vessels.
The legendary pilots were Dangerous Dan. He would do some really wild things. Piccolo Pete, who blew so many whistles that you ran out of air. There was a guy that was nicknamed Rock and Roll. He'd stand on the bridge and rock and roll when he was doing the job. It was a looser place to work, I'm sure, than what the guys have today.
We didn't have dress codes or things like that. We had a couple of younger fellows that were on tugboats that liked to wear costumes. So we were greeting passenger ships, and this one fella had this mask that you pull over your head like a gorilla. He'd run up and down the deck hollering and screaming, and people look around like, good Lord, what is this going on down there? I brought some water skis down. The tugboat was called the Glory. And I got up the wheelhouse, got on my bathing suit, got the ropes all ready. So we took off, and I popped up on the water skis. And by golly, there was proof that you can ski behind this boat. So we all got memos that to behave ourselves and put our clothes on and behave like gentlemen, because we were not helping our image at all.
Despite easygoing good times in the 1950s, Los Angeles and the port were busier than ever. In 1953, international shipping hit 25 million tons, a new high. Celebrating the port's 50th anniversary in 1958, harbor revenues were $7.8 million. To feed another Southern California construction boom, the port handled 185.5 million board feet of lumber. The completion of the final section of breakwater had created 5,500 acres of safe anchorage. Commerce with Japan, soon to be an important American trading partner, had reopened. But events in another Asian country would also have an impact on the Port of Los Angeles. During the Korean War, Fort MacArthur became a reserve training center, and military service and defense activities were accelerated in the Port of Los Angeles, as the United States also continued a Cold War with the Soviet Union.
I came here because the family I was with were in the military, and the hills around here were honeycombed with Nike missile sites. And I always will remember the first time I walked into one with the group, and we came back and it was a missile, and I accidentally bumped up against it, and something fell off the nose cone. I was terrified. I knew that one of two things had happened. One, I'd either broken the missile, or two, I was instituting World War III. As it turned out, it was just a cover that was on the end that kept dust out of the missile, so therefore it didn't affect the guidance system.
San Pedro and Wilmington had joined Los Angeles in 1908, but they were still 20 miles and more than an hour away. That sense of separation diminished in 1954 with the opening of the Harbor Freeway, promising high-speed transportation for trucks and cars.
It was a remarkable thing, the Harbor Freeway. It really did connect this part of Los Angeles to the other part, but it was an important link to the Port of Los Angeles.
Since the days of Spanish wagons, stagecoaches, and early trains, efficient transportation was critical to port success. Los Angeles always embraced the future, often at the expense of a sense of the past. By 1959, left behind by new freeways throughout Los Angeles, the venerable red cars were retired as obsolete. Many were sold or shipped overseas as scrap. San Pedro and Wilmington entered the freeway age as enthusiastically as any LA community. But old maritime traditions persisted.
Fisherman's Fiesta was a Catholic religious celebration of the success of the fleet. And it was a big, big thing in San Pedro. In the 1950s, it was like the second most photographed event in the world, maybe next to the Rose Parade.
And the boats would all decorate, and they would go around the harbor. There were contests too. They would judge to see what boat had the best decoration. And each year they had certain themes for the decoration.
It was the blessing of the fleet so that they would make a good catch. And when you see our beautiful church, Mary Star of the Sea, and at the top of the spire, there is Mary, the golden icon, looking out to sea, embracing the harbor, always blessing them. And it still gives me goosebumps.
The Fisherman's Fiesta brought thousands of tourists. During the 1950s, 2 million visitors a year also enjoyed Cabrillo Beach, and pleasure boats shared port space with freighters. But the Port of Los Angeles was a gateway to the world. In 1959, the Harbor Commission announced a 5-year plan for global outreach and $36.7 million for port expansion. By then, a revolution had begun. In 1958, Matson Line's Hawaiian Merchant arrived in the Port of Los Angeles. Rather than a hold full of assorted cargo, on board were 20 large boxes. They were called containers. In a way, they carried the future.